Welcome, everyone, to our live webinar, 9/11, An Architect's Guide, a three-part series. Today is Thursday, December 12th, 2020. I'm Richard Gage, AIA, member of the American Institute of Architects and founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization representing a growing body of now more than 3,000 architects and engineers signed on to the petition demanding a new investigation into the destruction of all three World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11. Last week, we presented part one, World Trade Center Building 7. That was the third skyscraper to collapse on 9/11, which most people don't even know anything about, including architects and engineers. This is part two today, the Twin Towers explosive destruction, in which we'll be examining the explosive evidence and the structural dynamics of how the Twin Towers collapsed. First, let me introduce you to our operations manager, Andy Steele. Hi, Andy.
Hello, Richard. Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. Just to let everyone know, I'm here to help with any technical glitches, which will occur from time to time. Also, we're going to be taking your questions at the end of the webinar today. Best way to submit them is to go to ae911truth.org, select continuing education, and pick the live webinars. You'll see a box. You can type them in right there. I will definitely see them if you do that. I'll also be looking at our Facebook broadcast of this webinar and on YouTube as well for any good comments or questions related to the material that Richard will be presenting. So with all of that said, back to you, Richard.
Thanks, Andy. And just so you guys know, Andy is the host of our 9/11 Freefall program. So be sure to catch that on Thursdays at 7 p.m. Pacific. Andy, where do they go to find 9/11 Freefall the best?
Best way that you can catch it is go to 911freefall.com. I'll definitely have the link there via SoundCloud that you can download or list stream right there on the site. But you'll always see it there, and it's all over the place, too. No Lies Radio, BBS Radio, and a number of other stations. So all you got to do is look for it, and you should find it.
Pretty awesome. Thanks, Andy. And just so people know something about my background, I was responsible at a local firm here in the San Francisco Bay Area for the construction documents for these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums and the construction administration for this $125 million high school. And more recently, before launching full-time into this important outreach effort, I had similar responsibilities working on this. Hey, the slides aren't going. Oh, great. Something went wrong with PowerPoint, it says. Hang on, guys. I'm going to fix this in like 2 seconds. Here we go. One. No, it's going to take more time than that, isn't it? It's misbehaving. Let's just do this. There's more than one way to deal with stuff like this. We'll take it by storm. And here we are. We have more recently, I worked on these 6 blocks of retail mid-rise office space, $400 million project with 1,200 tons of fireproof steel framing. And that's what garnered most of my attention. But lately, I've been working on full-time, working with architects, engineers to understand what really happened at the World Trade Center using the material in these courses. So that's what we're going to do today, focus on the Twin Towers and getting into the design just to touch on it. Some hailed it as the crowning achievement of the international style. Others called it heartless modernism. Robert Stern calls it gigantic dumbness. Right? You just extrude 2 squares until they become the tallest buildings in the world, which up until that time, the Empire State Building was the tallest building in the world, 76. So compare the design, like we're talking about a beautiful unfolding massing of this Art Deco style. I mean, really extraordinary creativity went into these. I don't know about modern architecture. I'm not fooled. But in the Twin Towers, we have an extraordinary set of technological achievements, one of which was getting 50,000 occupants in each tower to their destinations and 140,000 visitors with 99 elevator cabs in each tower, dropping passengers at sky lobbies in the middle. Like it's like a whole new building is starting up there. You have to get out, transfer, and go up. This had not been done before. An amazing achievement, really. But even greater than that was the structural innovation here, because up until this time, these skyscrapers were filled with a forest of columns that actually impeded the ability of the architects and engineers and the tenants to lay out their offices. So what they did in the Twin Towers was push out half the columns to the outside with these as spandrel panels that were welded to the 3 vertical columns, and then in turn each brought out and lifted into shape, into place, and bolted. So this was meant for very quick erection of these buildings. And in the center, the rest of the columns, massive columns, 47 incredibly large columns, almost solid steel at the bottom, and in mid-height, 2 inches or so. And between these 2 sets of columns, bridged by these lightweight steel trusses with 4-inch thick and 8-inch thick concrete poured over these metal panels, which you don't see in the diagram there. So this yielded an open office, 60 feet open, no columns, for 60 feet on the top and bottom sides here, and 35 feet on the sides. I mean, this is an amazing expanse that you see here. But there were some problems with the design, nevertheless, as you can imagine. Those columns are marching every 3 feet 4 inches on center all the way around this building. Some said it's like a jail cell, especially compared to the 1980s and 90s. The skyscrapers began to open up even greater vistas of the cityscape below, and with large picture windows. They had higher ceilings than the Twin Towers here at 12 feet. And by the time of 9/11, for sure, they had diminishing tenants. They couldn't get had to pay people to come into this building because it required upgrading of mechanical, electrical, and communication systems, like $10 to $15 billion. The city of New York was requiring the Port Authority to abate the asbestos in these buildings because they were laced with asbestos. It was a multi-billion-dollar job. And so some wonder why Larry Silverstein came along and was able to acquire the entire building just 6 weeks prior to 9/11 from its publicly held position by the Port Authority, with just on his part a $15 million investment, which he leveraged to $3.2 billion. So quite a deal for some enterprising journalists to undertake and figure out what really happened there. But then he put on massive terrorist insurance, unheard of before in the history of skyscrapers. So he paid out well. We're talking $6.8 billion he walked away with to develop the entire site. He owned it, lock, stock, and barrel. So fascinating. But we digress there. Let's go back in history here to 9/11, 2001, and find out what happened that morning.
On September 11th, we learned that 4 passenger planes were hijacked and taken radically off course. Within an hour, 2 of the planes had flown into the enormous steel towers of the World Trade Center, creating fires and eventually toppling them. Dazed by the news, the American public soon believed the fires in the towers had burned so hot they caused the steel frames of the buildings to give way. A myth developed, fed by official sources through the media to a bewildered audience. Elements of the myth. The impact of the airplanes, gallons of burning jet fuel, steel melting, the buildings failing and suddenly imploding. In a mere 10 seconds, 110 stories hurtled earthward, pulverizing into dust. Right from the start, on the street itself, the official story was born.
Come out of nowhere and just scream right into the side of the Twin Tower, exploding through the other side. And then I witnessed both towers collapse, one first and then the second, mostly due to structural failure because the fire was just too intense.
The myth bled into the FEMA report and was echoed by the experts.
It was the combination of the impact load doing great damage to the building, followed by the fire, that caused collapse.
Well, here, excuse me, in a nutshell, we have the official story. Where did it come from? Perhaps from that guy on the street, right? Who had all the answers that structural engineers have been arguing about for so long. So let's look at it. The North Towers hit at about 8:46 in the morning by American Airlines Flight 11. It doesn't collapse until an hour and a half later. Some people associate the incredible explosion of jet fuel with the collapse of these towers. They're two completely separate events. Even NIST acknowledges that 90% of the jet fuel burns up outside the building. It's just gone like instantly. The rest of it's gone in about 10 minutes. The jet fuel simply started a fire, just like lighter fluid, for instance, in your briquette, start in your barbecue. So same thing at the South Tower. It was hit at 9:03 a.m. It collapses only an hour later, though, by flight 175. And so it's hit about 30 stories down. The North Tower is hit about 15 stories down. Now, there were some investigations into these collapses, as we're told. Destruction is what we like to call it. The American Society of Civil Engineers had assembled some volunteers initially, volunteers which worked their way into subsequent investigations, very closely held, hand-picked volunteers. The FEMA report included some of these individuals, finally got $600,000 worth of funding, and their efforts were quite hampered. They couldn't get access to the blueprints of the building, says the New York Times. They couldn't get access to the site, adequate access. They couldn't get access to the steel to investigate it, or access to the public to get photographs. It was quite a mess. And we'll look at the investigations here. But in 2005, NIST takes over that investigation with $20 million of funding from Congress. They were tasked to determine how the towers collapsed. And we'll see how they did with that. But essentially their theory here was that the fires were so intense that they caused these lightweight floor trusses, with the fireproofing having been knocked off, if you will, by the airplanes, then vulnerable to heat. And this sagging floor truss causes the perimeter columns to bow inward. And then this caused the building to fail, with the upper part driving the rest of the building down to the ground and then destroying itself. We'll come back to that. But sagging floor trusses don't have the lateral force necessary to pull in these 14-inch square steel tube columns. So in their computer model, NIST saw fit to make sure that they indeed did fail by imposing a 5,000-pound force on every truss connection, forcing those columns to fail. And but the fires in themselves, they weren't even burning hot at that time. They were quite diminished at the time of the collapse, indicated by the thick black smoke that these are oxygen-starved and cooler fires. So we go back to the scientific method at Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. We have a question. How do the towers come down? Well, we do some background research. How have other towers come down? We do make some observations, construct a hypothesis, our best guess as to how we think the towers came down. We don't focus in on a hypothesis that's generated by our commitment to political or financial influences. No, this is the scientific method. Maybe jet planes did bring the towers down. Okay, that's a rational hypothesis. Maybe it was ensuing fires, another rational hypothesis. Maybe it was explosions, a very rational hypothesis, as you'll see today. And these hypotheses are laid out without respect, as I mentioned, to those influences that might sway our objective opinion in the matter as to how the towers came down. Maybe even controlled demolition, as you'll see today, as a rational hypothesis. These two last competing hypotheses were not even acknowledged, much less analyzed by NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who was tasked by Congress, again, to explain these collapses to the American people. We test those hypotheses with experiments after making predictions, analyze the results, draw conclusions. If the hypothesis is corroborated, we report the results in an open, transparent manner so all can build on the body of the work that we do. If it's not corroborated, we go back. We try again. We construct a new hypothesis that does stand a better chance against the data, the experiments, and so forth. And that's what we're doing today. We're looking at an alternative set of hypotheses, explosions and controlled demolition, until we find a hypothesis that is corroborated by the evidence. So let's go ahead and look at forces that destroy buildings. Fire is certainly a force that can destroy buildings. It's an organic, chaotic process. It burns out an area in roughly 20 minutes or so, moving on looking for fresh new fuel sources. So that's all the fuel there is in our modern office buildings, about 20 minutes or 30 minutes, as even acknowledged by NIST, that these fires didn't persist in any one location for more than 20 or 30 minutes. It's really important because it completely defies their theory, particularly in Building 7, which we looked at in last week's part 1 of this series. This is part 2 of the series. Next week, we go to part 3. So skyscrapers haven't collapsed due to fires, though. Why? We haven't lost one steel frame skyscraper. But say in wood frame buildings, they would fall over to the path of least resistance. As you might expect, there'd be a hesitancy, and then it would fall in stages and not straight down through the tons of structure that's intact and cold hard below, resisting such a collapse. Now, fortunately for us, there is a test that was done, the largest test of its kind in 1995 by British Steel in Cardington, UK. They built an 8-story building out of steel framing, part of which was fireproofed and part of which was not fireproofed. And so we they lit the whole thing on fire with incredible quantities of kindling, trying to get up to 2,000 degrees if they could. And they found that it didn't fail. But it's inherently stable due to the highly redundant nature of the structural steel form. Yes, there's some warpage. which can occur when steel exceeds its 1200 degree Fahrenheit critical temperature, at which it can lose half of its strength and begin to sag, as these columns did, and warp. But that's after a long period of time. But what about steel frame skyscrapers that were much hotter, larger, and longer lasting than the fires in the World Trade Center? What happens to these structures?
May 4th, 1988, the First Interstate Bank, a 62-story building in Los Angeles, California, suffered a 3.5-hour fire which burned across 5 floors and caused an estimated $200 million of damage. It did not collapse. February 23rd, 1991, the One Meridian Plaza, a 38-story building in Philadelphia, suffered an 18-hour fire which burned across 8 floors. The fire caused an estimated $100 million worth of damage and 3 firefighters died fighting it. It was later described by officials as the most significant fire of the century. It did not collapse. October 17th, 2004, the East Tower of the Park Central complex in Caracas, Venezuela, suffered a 17-hour fire which spread across 26 of its 56 floors. It did not collapse. August 18th, 2007, a fire broke out on the 17th floor of the Deutsche Bank building in New York, a building undergoing deconstruction after being heavily damaged by debris from the South Tower on 9/11. Originally 41 stories in height, it had been reduced to 26 at the time of the fire, which lasted 7 hours and affected a total of 10 floors. 2 firefighters died of smoke inhalation. It did not collapse. On 9/11 itself, 5 World Trade Center, a 9-story building east of the North Tower, was engulfed in flames after sustaining heavy damage from falling debris. A number of partial collapses occurred, but the overall structure remained standing. February 9th, 2009, the Mandarin Oriental Hotel in Beijing was completely engulfed in flames for more than 3 hours during the Lunar New Year celebrations. The fire affected all 44 floors, igniting fireworks as it burned. 1 firefighter died fighting it. It did not collapse.
So we just don't have collapses due to fires in these buildings. Not even after 9/11, in these fully engulfed, where these fires fully engulfed these buildings. Steel frame skyscrapers and many other skyscrapers that are fireproofed do not collapse due to fire. So that's pretty darn interesting. And yet these fires, which were diminished at the time of the collapse, brought these buildings down. You can see why we're beginning to look at this a little more critically. Let's jump to natural collapses. In this case, collapses by earthquakes of tall buildings, where we have a building that is buildings that have fallen over. They're certainly damaged, but they're recognizable as a building. We will compare that to the Twin Towers upon their collapse. The columns and beams are not severed one from another. The concrete is not pulverized to a fine powder. So let's look at buildings that have been exploded. We have thick, billowing, enormous pyroclastic-like clouds of rapidly expanding cauliflower-shaped forms due to the incredible heat from the gases that are expanding and released during the chemical ignition of these explosives. We have witnesses that hear explosions. We have witnesses that see flashes of light. If you have these features, you know you have explosions. Now, explosions are not a part of the official story of 9/11, and yet we're going to be looking at an awful lot of witnesses coming up here who testify otherwise. Fires, by the way, have never done this to buildings. These are controlled demolitions. This is a process which a handful of experts across the country is all we have that can accomplish controlled demolition. They engineer and place shaped cutter charges against specific locations in the columns and against the columns and beams in these buildings. And then they set them off in a precise order, as you see here, resulting in the fall of these buildings that actually has a fairly consistent set of features, beginning with a sudden onset of destruction. It doesn't hesitate, collapse, slow. Usually it's near the base of the structure, by the way, but that doesn't have to happen. It's not always that way. A straight down symmetrical collapse is what results then, often into the building's own footprint, if that's what they want to accomplish. Again, there's a pattern, because there's a patterned removal of columns at the key locations, and that results in the freefall acceleration, usually. Not always, but it can be freefall, as fast as that, as fast as a bowling ball falling out of the sky through what was the path of greatest resistance. So we have the total dismemberment of the structural steel form, broken up and ready for loading and shipment. We have limited damage to adjacent structures, feature number 6. That's one of the goals of controlled demolition. And there's patterned explosions that witnesses see. They hear, they see flashes of light. So feature number 8, the concrete floors are broken up or completely pulverized. You don't want to have to go back into a controlled demolition and use a jackhammer for that kind of, let the explosives do that work of breaking up the concrete. Feature number 9, so those explosive charges are visible often at many of the floors. We'll be looking at that today with the Twin Towers. And feature number 10, we see that there's chemical evidence left behind of such explosive residue. So if you have these features, you have direct evidence of destruction with explosives. A fire does not create these features, any of them, let alone all of them. Fires cause structures that are less robust to collapse asymmetrically with gradual deformations, say in wood frame fires, following the path of least resistance. So that's really important. Now, why are steel frame buildings so immune to fire? Well, one reason is steel conducts that heat away. So it never reaches its 1200 degree Fahrenheit temperature, at which it can lose half of its strength and begin to sag. But just to keep that from happening ever, we put fireproofing on these buildings, a cement-like fireproofing, 2 and 3 hour fire protection. Now that is 4 to 6 times more fire protection than it needs, because as NIST even acknowledged, their fire burns in an given area only 20 to 30 minutes. So this is an incredible quantity of fire protection in these buildings. And we keep the tenants from bringing in content, fuel content that's large. They only just desks or chairs, and of course paper, things like that. Rugs can burn, but they're highly regulated. Carpeting. And we don't build these buildings out of combustible materials, at least in the US. In the UK, they had a problem, right? The plastic panels on the outside turned out to be quite combustible, causing a number of deaths there in London. And we, just to keep all that from becoming a problem, we put fire sprinklers in these buildings to keep fires from getting out of control at all and even becoming a problem. The fire sprinklers were said to have been damaged by the airplane impacts in the Twin Towers. We don't argue that point. We have a lot of other points to make. Well, with additional circumstantial corroborative evidence, such as government documentation, that can be very helpful if we have it. Foreknowledge of the destruction. We know when a building's going to be coming down in advance. At least some people do. Experts agreeing, that's a controlled demolition. At least those experts without financial or political obligations that might sway their objective opinion in the matter. With video documentation, of course, all this can be proof of controlled demolition. A proof which we want to apply to the Twin Towers, of course. So let's do that. Beginning at the beginning here, feature number 1. Is there a sudden onset of destruction at the location of the jet impacts, in this case, not down at the bottom of the building as is typical in controlled demolitions. But you see, this is what we're seeing here is a magic show. Our attention is being diverted to believe that the towers came down by the impact of the jet plane impacts and the fires. But Something else is going on here. And we're going to be looking at that for the remaining time here. But let's take a look. We're in a steady state of stillness, and all of a sudden, the building launches into a smooth, sudden descent. There's no impact, et cetera, et cetera. There's no jolt. There's no hesitation, as we were led to believe might happen. In the South Tower, same thing. The building is still, and then it begins its smooth, sudden descent now. So we're going to take a closer look at the destruction of these buildings. But let's look at feature number 2. Is there patterned explosions and flashes of light heard and seen by witnesses? Well, we go to the oral histories created by Thomas von Essen, who sought to preserve these accounts before they became reshaped by a collective memory, which they did largely, most unfortunately anyway. But he's got 500 first responders recorded in 12,000 pages of written testimony of those oral recordings. But we didn't know about it until the court ordered the release of this information in August of 2005, 4 years after 9/11. We finally understand that all of these first responders, including 118 specifically talking about observing flashes, sounds of explosions, and phenomena of explosive demolition. Let's look at a couple of them. We felt the ground shake. You could see the towers sway, and then it just came down. Now, again and again, you're going to see this specific order of events from these expert witnesses. Felt the ground shake. You could see the towers sway, and then it just came down. They're seeing this phenomena, they're hearing this phenomena, and then the building comes down. Listen again. All of a sudden, the ground just started shaking. Felt like a train running underneath my feet. The next thing we know, we look up and the tower is collapsing. It shook my bones. Shortly before the first tower came down, I remember feeling the ground shaking. I heard a terrible noise, and then debris just started flying everywhere. An explosion appeared at the very top. Simultaneously from all 4 sides, materials shot out horizontally. And then there seemed to be a momentary delay before you could see the beginning of the collapse. This is very, very specific testimony. There was an explosion in the South Tower, one floor under another. When it hit about the 5th floor, I figured it was a bomb because it looked like a synchronized, deliberate kind of thing. Seemed like on television when they blow up these buildings, seemed like it was going all the way around like a belt. All these explosions. Let's look at the North Tower and see what they might be referring to. In comparison to a known controlled demolition on the left, North Tower on the right, is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives? Especially since it looks exactly like a controlled demolition. Especially since fire, the official cause of this building's collapse, has never brought down a skyscraper, ever. Not a steel-framed, fireproof skyscraper. So we have something to be very careful. In fact, shouldn't NIST have had controlled demolition as their first, if not their only serious hypothesis is the word I was looking for there. Really, but no, it was relegated to a series of very frequently asked questions of NIST, and they put it out only years later. Why didn't NIST consider a controlled demolition hypothesis with matching computer modeling and explanation like it did for the pancake theory hypothesis? Well, they start off by saying how many experts they put on this, 200 technical experts, 1,000 people interviewed, 7,000 segments of video looked at, 7,000 photographs. But we don't support the controlled demolition. Collapse was initiated in the impact and fire floors and nowhere else. In other words, It didn't happen. It didn't start at the bottom of the building, so it couldn't be a controlled demolition. Video evidence shows unambiguously that the collapse progressed from the top to the bottom. What? No evidence of any blast or explosion below the impact. Well, we're going to show you such evidence today. But even so, we're also going to show you a top-down controlled demolition. So let's go on. This firefighter or paramedic says, you ever see professional demolition where they set charges on certain floors? And then you hear pop, pop, pop. When I heard that friggin' noise, that's when I saw the building coming down. Somewhere around the middle of the World Trade Center, there was this orange and red flash coming out. Initially, it's just one flash. Then this flash just kept popping all the way around the building, and that building had started to explode. Saw a number of brief light sources being emitted from inside the building between floors 10 and 15. He saw about 6 of these flashes, accompanied by a crackling sound before the tower collapsed. I saw low-level flashes. I saw flash, flash, flash. Then it looked like the building came down. The building was blowing out on all 4 sides. We actually heard the pops. You heard the pops of the building. With each popping sound, it was initially an orange and then a red flash that came out of the building. Then it would just go all around the building on both sides. Let's look at the South Tower in relation to a controlled demolition on the left, South Tower on the right. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives, especially since it looks exactly like a controlled demolition, and especially since fire, the official cause of this building's collapse, has never brought down a skyscraper? I thought the terrorists planted explosives somewhere in the building. That's how loud it was, a crackling explosive. Another loud boom at the upper floors. Then there was a series of smaller explosions which appeared to go completely around the building at the upper floors. Lower level of the building. Like when they demolish a building? That's what I thought I saw. Did you see any flashes? I said, yes. Well, I thought it was just me. He said, no, I saw them too. Everybody at that point, I think, still thought these things were blown up. So I was fully expecting anything else to blow up. You were there when the planes hit? No, I was there when the building exploded. He said, you mean when it fell down? No, when it exploded. Let's listen to these additional witnesses.
As we were getting our gear on and making our way to the stairway, there was a heavy-duty explosion.
The whole building just collapsed on us inside the lobby.
Was that a secondary explosion?
Yes, it was.
That was the
planet probably.
Yeah, definitely secondary explosion.
I heard a second explosion and another rumble.
An hour later than that, we had that big explosion from much, much lower.
It just went boom. It was like a bomb went off. And another explosion came right from it, just everyone flying.
There were numerous secondary explosions taking place in that building. There were continuous explosions.
No, the first explosion, then there was a second explosion in the same building. There were 2 explosions.
Okay.
Federal agencies that were down there do believe that there was some sort of explosive device somewhere else besides the planes hitting.
There was another explosion that took place in one of the towers here. So obviously, according to his theory, he thinks that there were actually devices that were planted in the building.
There was a secondary explosion, probably a device either planted before or on the aircraft that did not explode until an hour later.
Then there was no secondary explosions and then the subsequent collapses.
That the FBI most likely thinks that there was a car or truck packed with explosives underneath the buildings, which also exploded at the same time and brought both of them down.
Now, that's the first time we're hearing that. So 2 planes and explosives that were in the building. Is that correct?
That is the working theory at this point. That is
a huge explosion now waiting to bring on all of us.
It sounded like gunfire, bang, 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 bang. And then all of a sudden, 3 big explosions.
About 50 consecutive bangs, and it fell down like a waterfall.
And we heard the noise associated with an implosion. We heard a very loud blast, an explosion. We looked up, and the building literally began to collapse before us.
We heard a loud explosion, and at that point, Building 2 was collapsing. At that point, we heard a large boom. I looked up and just saw the building coming at us.
Do you know if it was an explosion or if it was a building collapse?
To me, it sounded like an explosion.
There was another major explosion. The building itself, literally the top of it came down.
All of a sudden you hear explosion and you could see the building starting to collapse.
Huge explosion that we all heard and felt.
We understand now there has been a secondary explosion on Tower 2.
According to the Associated Press, another building that has either been attacked or exploded.
The tower, rather, that has collapsed, though we are told, collapsed because of a third explosion.
And about an hour later after that, there was a huge explosion at the base of the South Tower. That's the One World Trade Center, and part of the building collapsed.
We could hear a rumble, which was about 5 seconds long, preceding the actual collapse, and then a boom when each of those towers collapsed.
Just seconds ago, there was a huge explosion, and it appears right now the Second World Trade Tower has just collapsed.
I was about 5 blocks away when I heard explosions.
And then you heard from far away, boom, boom. And you heard the boom, 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 boom.
Floor by floor started popping out.
It was if they had detonated.
Yeah,
if they were planned to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
From the corner, boom, 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 boom. Just like 20 straight hits. And as the bombs were going, people just started running. And I sat there and watched a few of them explode, and it just started going pop. It just started going boom, 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 boom. And he goes, how fast? I go, like firecrackers.
How many of these witnesses of explosions do you imagine were included in the NIST report? Any of their reports? Not one. Not one. Are these important enough? Are these not important enough to be included, examined? I mean, they said they interviewed 1,000 people. Come on. They said, well, it couldn't be a controlled demolition because it didn't start at the bottom. Let's look at a top-down controlled demolition here and listen to Mark Loiseau, the key expert of controlled demolitions in this country.
You can go almost anywhere in the structure, and given the right circumstances, you can release all of that stored energy, converting it into what is called kinetic energy. That's energy in motion, and that's what brings the building down.
There's a top-down controlled demolition. NIST says, well, the upper block of floors drove the rest of the building down to the ground and then destroyed itself. There's a problem with this theory, this speculation. It disobeys Newton's third law of motion. There's an equal and opposite destructive action when two bodies collide. Let's look at it this way. We run a Volkswagen into a Mack truck. Which one's destroyed? The lighter one. Does it matter if we drop the Volkswagen onto the Mack truck? No, the lighter part of a building cannot possibly destroy the cold, hard, heavy steel underneath the point of jet plane impacts, which is getting thicker and thicker, these columns, as you go down to where at mid-height, they're 2 inches thick, 36 inches by 16 inches, and then they get bigger and thicker to where they're almost solid steel at the base, 52 inches by 22 inches. Well, this theory came from Zdenek Bazant of Chicago Northwestern University. And it's an extremely complex paper. It's called the crush down, crush up theory. Now, the rest of us were in shock and awe on September 11th, but not this gentleman. This structural engineer was busy working away in his attic, so coming up with this theory to try to explain how these towers completely destroyed themselves. And it was submitted just 2 days after 9/11. It just doesn't seem plausible, but let's look at it. It violates the laws of physics. Formulas are actually correct. It was finally decoded by engineers because it's extremely obfuscating. But the input data is false. First of all, they completely eliminate an entire story of columns, 12-foot tall, well, they're taller than that, 15-foot tall columns. Actually, they're 17-foot tall columns. And they eliminated so they can develop this artificial, false, fraudulent, dynamic impact load of falling 17 feet. No, they're not 17 feet. I got to look this up. I think it's about 15 feet. Anyway, it's artificial. They doubled the mass up above. They decreased the column strength below by a factor of 3 and eliminated the column reserve strength altogether. These columns are 3 to 5 times stronger than they need to be to hold up the building. That's just the way structural engineers design. So the results of this is that the energy of the falling mass was rendered 4 times greater. The energy absorption capacity of the structure below rendered 3 times less capable. It's rigged 12 to 1 in favor of a collapse. So we have a huge problem. The actual downward momentum movement would have been arrested after 2 seconds when you use a real calculation. There wouldn't have been this continued downward momentum at all. So what caused that? Because I showed you how the building did come down. We'll talk about what caused that. But these errors were refuted by engineers, specifically Tony Zamboni, Richard Johns, in 2014 to the American Society of Civil Engineers, which originally published Besant's paper. But the errors were upheld by the American Society of Civil Engineers. They won't publish the paper. Hold on 1 second. I got to do something real quick here. 1 second, and there. So why won't they publish it? We wanted to find out. They said, well, gosh, it's out of scope. Out of scope? How is it out of scope to expose the errors in a paper that's been previously published in the same journal? It is not out of scope. And this is an ethics case which is being reviewed right now. Can't tell you any more about that. But let's look at the upper part, because guess what? It is being destroyed in the first 3 seconds. Look at the diagram here. Look at the red arrow. There's no downward movement of that red arrow. We're told that this upper block is crushing the lower block, but no, the upper block is being destroyed itself. The Volkswagen is being destroyed right before your eyes. The question is, what's destroying it? And we're going to get to that too, because we see that upon stop. Now, we just like the firefighters described, we have all the way around the building explosions going off all 4 sides and go. So NIST says that this is being caused by the inward bowing of these columns, which is being caused by the sagging of these floor trusses as they're pulling in the columns. We talked about how that couldn't happen. But what we do see is that the columns were inward bowing. The question is, what's causing them to bow inward? And a clue can be found right here from the FEMA report author, Gene Corley.
When the collapse finally starts, the antenna started just a little bit before the exterior of the building started. And that tells us that the core columns let go first.
So he's saying that the antenna drops first. Down 2, up 2, down 2. You can see it as you compare it, the top of the antenna against the top of the picture. 2, up 2, down 2, up 2. Well, what's the antenna sitting on? The antenna sits on this hat truss. What does the hat truss sit directly on? It sits on the core columns. So the core columns must be failing, and then the hat truss descends and then the antenna descends. So the question is, what's causing these core columns to fail? We'll get to that. But if the core columns are failing, they're pulling on these lightweight steel trusses, which is then pulling on the perimeter columns, causing them to bow inward. So, by the way, in none of these photographs or videos do we see any upper section of building that's driving the rest of the building down to the ground. It's not there. If it were there, we would see it would have crushed all of these remaining core columns that even after the rest of the building has come down, they remain 1,000 feet in the air. And then there's an explosion at the bottom, which brings all of them down as they descend frame by frame, visible down through after the explosion shakes the dust off. Is it a collapse or is it an explosion looking more like the volcanic eruption in the Tongan Sea in 2009 with upward, outward arching streamers, freely flying structural steel, in the case of the towers, solid objects, trailed by thick white smoke clouds? We'll get to the thick white smoke clouds trailing non-flammable structural steel in next week's part when we get into the extreme heat in the Twin Towers. For now, it doesn't look anything like a gravitational collapse. And that's what 36 reporters brought us. The Twin Towers explosive demolition in the early days of 9/11, eyewitness reporting, narrative reporting, source-based reporting, non-explosion reporters. Non-explosion reporters. Does that? I got to look at that. Hold on one second. That's puzzling that that's worded that way. We heard a very loud blast, an explosion, when the two explosions and the collapse of the World Trade Center happened. He said that there was another explosion which took place. These additional witnesses of explosions. So the conclusion of this report, which you can download from our website at AE911 Truth, is we conclude the hypothesis of explosions bringing the Twin Towers down was not only prevalent among reporters that day and the following days, but was in fact the dominant hypothesis. That's extremely important. So let's go to feature number 3. Is there a straight down symmetrical progression outside the building's footprint? In building 7, the third tower that collapsed on 9/11, we looked at a classic implosion into the building's footprint. Something else is going on here with the South Tower's destruction. It begins to fall over. In fact, it begins to fall. It's falling at 22 degrees off center of the structure below it. So we have asymmetrical loading from this part of the building that's falling off. We have asymmetrical damage from the airplanes hitting the towers up above. We have asymmetrical damage from the fire up above. How in the world do we get complete symmetrical destruction all the way down all 4 faces of this building? Both buildings. It's a non sequitur. It makes no sense. Let's zoom in on one corner of the building. What are we looking at? A gravitational collapse, which is somehow supposed to be 20 stories up above? Or are we looking at the leading edge of a series of hundreds of explosions right in front of our face? At some point, we got to get it. Now, those are the same explosions on the right, lower right side here. And yes, we'll talk about these explosions here in a moment. We have 1,200 feet in diameter, the debris field here. Even the Winter Gardens, 600 feet away from the North Tower, are destroyed by these structural steel sections. The steel frame is broken up. Oh, we got an interesting gray part here. Sorry, this video is not as clear, but here is the nice, neat pile of Building 7, an implosion, classic implosion, versus the very explosive event, the Twin Towers. So let's look at it here. Oh, great. Well, we'll jump to this one. So we have these squibs. Oh, fun. This video does not want to play. All right. We're going to restart right here at 2:58. Hang on, folks. Escape out of PowerPoint's acting funny today. But we're going to start it up right again here. And here it goes. So let's go back to this one. Here we have a series of explosions that are occurring 20, 40, even 60 stories down below what we're told is a gravitational collapse. NIST says these are puffs of light. Well, these are not, excuse me, puffs of air. These are not, this is not air. You can see the solids in these objects, in these explosions. But let's say there was a section of building up above driving the rest of the building down. The air's got to come out somewhere, right? Well, we saw that section of buildings gone in 4 seconds. But let's say it was there, and it's driving this air down the hoistway, and it's got to come out somewhere, right? So, but in this open office planning, it created by the structural innovations in these structural design, it would fill that large area up with air, right? And it's going to blow out all those windows or none of them, but not these highly focalized, pinpoint accurate, violent ejections that are called squibs in the controlled demolition industry. Let's look at the South Tower. On the left, you see dozens of these all at once. How in the world can that happen? All at once in this looped video, ejecting laterally out of the side of this building. The building its structure is being liquefied, if you will. Let's look at these squibs from the point of view of a physics teacher, David Chandler.
Here I'm measuring the ejection velocity of a squib on the east face of the South Tower. At this angle, there is foreshortening, but the calibration distance is foreshortened by the same proportion. Plotting horizontal position versus time, the slope indicates the ejection velocity, which is 67 meters per second, or 150 miles per hour.
150 miles per hour. This is 160 to 200 feet per second. These are not speeds of air pressure. This is explosive speeds. How fast is the building coming down? This is really important. Look at this. We have on the left a counter, on the right a computer animation. Here's 5 seconds and 7 seconds and 10 seconds. In about a dozen seconds, the entire building, both of them, have come down to the ground. This is incredible. And through, well, let's first look at the wisdom of a physicist here. Again, David Chandler.
We are here tracking the motion of the roofline at 0.2 second intervals through approximately 32 meters or 8 stories. This graph shows the height of the roofline as a function of time. The analysis is simpler if we plot velocity as a function of time. On this kind of a graph, a straight line indicates constant acceleration. First note that there is a sudden onset of collapse. as the point we are tracking makes a sudden transition from being at rest to an approximately constant downward acceleration. The slope of the graph indicates that the acceleration is 6.31 meters per second squared downward, which is 64% of freefall.
64% of freefall. It's almost freefall. It's accelerating straight down through what? 80,000 tons of structural steel beneath the point of jet plane impacts. Steel that's 3 to 5 times stronger than it needed to be to resist any such collapse. It's not slowing down when it meets this resistance. It's speeding up. How is it speeding up? We'll get to that. When a column buckles, it never loses more than about 25% of its strength, even after it bends in half almost. So there's still reserve strength in the plastic mode of a column's deformation, which means that the building could never have accelerated. It would have been slowed down by such buckling. Let's look at it another way. You have an entire upper story, 15 stories in the case of the North Tower, held up by this giant crane over nothing but air. Next to it, you take the same block, you put it over 95 stories of increasingly stronger steel, like you have in the Twin Towers design. We'll even take out one story here, as Zdenek Bazant did in his fraudulent paper submitted to the American Society of Civil Engineers. And we're going to let these go at once. Now, what happens? Well, a 7th grader can figure this out. The one on the right is going to fall as fast as a bowling ball falling out of the sky. That's free fall acceleration until it hits the ground in about 9 seconds. The one on the left is going to hit some incredible structure and slow down. It's not that difficult, is it? 7th grade physics, folks. Let's look at it from the point of view of Massimo Mizuko in his September 11th New Pearl Harbor DVD series, which I highly recommend, 5 hours.
Something of this kind is what we should have seen when the top section of the towers collapsed onto the lower one. The upper and lower sections should have mutually destroyed each other until all the energy is dissipated and the system comes to a rest. Alternatively, as shown in this experiment with 2 towers made of snow, the top section could have fallen off to the side after the initial collapse. What could not have happened is this.
A little tiny chunk of the building can't possibly fall and crush the entire structure below it.
This is such a simple, fundamental concept that architects and engineers were astonished in seeing it totally ignored by NIST.
This is high school physics, and our whole society is being led to believe that these fundamental laws of physics, hard science, don't apply anymore.
But they do, of course. And that's why we have had yet another attempt, and a successful attempt in this case, to submit the logic into a peer-reviewed paper, in this case, the Journal of Protective Structures. And this one was actually published by Gregory Zudolinski, Anthony Zambodi, and Richard Johns. So the word is getting out there in some cases. Well, let's look and see if we do have the shattering of the steel structure, because the National Fire Protection Association 921, the Guide for Fire and Explosion Investigation, says, look for effects of explosions when you're investigating. Now, NIST did have quite an influence in, hold on one second. There we go. Hold on one second. And there we go. Good. In the creation of this document says, look for shrapnel effects, high order damage, characterized by shattering of the structure, producing small pulverized debris with the building completely demolished, debris thrown great distances. We'll look at all of this evidence here because the building is completely shattered all the way down to the ground, save these remaining shards on the side of this building, if you will. The steel frame is completely shattered, one component from another almost, into its original 37.5-foot lengths, ready for loading and shipment. So how about the lateral ejection of these materials? Well, let's go into it. This same guide, 921, says look for blast pressure wave effects. The heavy structural steel pieces freely flying, which we, of course, have, landing 300 to 600 feet away in all directions from the Twin Towers, impaling in the sides of buildings. And the freely flying structural steel forms sections weighing 4 tons tracked individually, freely flying. This is not like a banana peeling. Uh-oh. Hold on. This PowerPoint's acting up again. Here we go. And it really does want to act up. Look at this. 45 degrees. That structural steel section freely flying again, shot out horizontally. How does gravity work? Gravity works down. What's happening here? Out. What is the force driving this 4-ton structural steel section laterally? Let's go to physics teacher David Chandler again. Oh, we can try. I'm going to start that up again. And here we go. Try this.
Girders weighing several tons were found 600 feet from the base of the North Tower. How fast they were ejected depends on where they originated. If they came from high in the building, they were thrown outward at about 50 miles per hour. If they came from lower down, the speed had to be even greater. Gravity alone cannot account for such high lateral ejection speeds.
I'm here measuring the horizontal speed of what appears to be one or more wall units, which are being thrown northward from the North Tower. Because it was recorded by a handheld camera, I had to first stabilize the image. Then I did the measurements from the stabilized version of the video. Final result, 35 meters per second, which is 78 miles per hour.
78 miles per hour. This is enough energy to hurl a 200-pound or fire a 200-pound cannonball 3 miles. Where's that energy coming from? By the way, if 100,000 tons of structural steel framing is distributed outside the footprint of this building, then what's crushing the building? It's not available to crush the rest of the building if it's found 600 feet outside the footprint of the building, is it? Well, you might think, well, maybe it's the concrete crushing the building. We will come back to that. Let's look at the concrete. We'll come back to it right now because guess what? The floors are missing, the concrete floors. There's 110 of them. Each of them are an acre in size, 4 and 8-inch thick concrete slabs. We don't see them at the bottom. Now, in a real gravitational collapse, like in Mexico, we see pancaked floors, but it's missing at the Twin Towers. Where is all of the concrete floors? Oh, it's pulverized in midair. All of the photographs and videos show 90,000 tons of concrete in each building, pulverized to 100 micron particles and distributed outside the World Trade Center itself, the entire complex, covering lower Manhattan in a 3 square mile area of a 3-inch thick blanket of concrete powder. Up to 30% of this blanket of World Trade Center dust is concrete powder, according to the analysis by the U.S. Geological Survey. Let's go to the governor, Pataki of New York.
And you see, and there's no concrete. There's very little concrete. All you see is aluminum and steel. What happened to the concrete? The concrete was pulverized. And I was down here Tuesday, and it was like you were on a foreign planet. All of lower Manhattan, not just this site, from river to river, there was dust, powder, 2-3 inches thick. The concrete was just pulverized.
You have 2 110-story office buildings. You don't find a desk. You don't find a chair. You don't find a telephone, a computer. The biggest piece of a telephone I found was half of the keypad, and it was about this big. The building collapsed to dust.
What I expected to see was nothing like what I actually did see at the time of my arrival at the site. There wasn't much that you could say, you could describe. Everything was dust and metal. There was no typewriters, there was no chairs, there was no nothing.
By the way, if 90,000 tons of concrete is pulverized and spread over 3 square miles, then we have to ask ourselves again, what's crushing the building? It's not the steel, and it's not the concrete. That's 2/3 of the weight of this building. It's not there. Think about it. You've been had. We've all been had. That's why I'm angry. That's why I'm doing something, and I hope you will too. There's nothing left. Well, there's not much left to crush the building. In fact, there must have been 10,000 file cabinets, but this is the only one that they could find. It survived because it was in the basement, and it was from an ice cream store. They couldn't find one other file cabinet. What about the people?
In April 2006, New Yorkers were distressed to learn that bone fragments, human remains from 9/11, had been found on the roof of the nearby Deutsche Bank building.
And how, in God's name, did those fragments get there?
And bone fragments less than a centimeter long. How could they be so small?
Wait a minute. We have 700 bone fragments found on top of this building, the Deutsche Bank building. They didn't come from the people in this airplane because it hit the South Tower and sent its ejections out this way. They didn't come from the people in this airplane because it hit the North Tower and those ejections were blocked by the South Tower from even reaching the Deutsche Bank building. So they're not from the people in the planes. Some of them were from firefighters. But guess what? And you can tell by the red symbols. The firefighters weren't on the scene at the time of the airplane impacts. So there was 2,753 victims altogether, but only 300 whole bodies found. 21,900 pieces of bodies found altogether. 6,000 of them were small enough to fit into a test tube. 200 pieces matched to one single person. And yet, more than 1,000 of these victims were completely unaccounted for. Not a trace. They were vaporized. Think about that. The body parts they could find were 800 feet outside the Twin Towers. Many of them. As you can tell by these small green triangles and even some red ones further away. Can gravitational collapse cause such pulverization of body parts and distribution of them? No. Extremely unlikely. So we've been looking so far at the eight of the key characteristic and very uncharacteristic features, by the way, of controlled demolition, of destruction. Direct evidence of destruction with explosives is what we have here. Fire doesn't create any of these features, let alone all of them. With additional fires cause less robust structures to collapse. They do so asymmetrically with gradual deformations following the path of least resistance. Especially these fires are not going to be causing that kind of incredible destruction that we've been looking at today, which were diminished at the time of the collapse, indicated by the thick black smoke. They're oxygen starved and cooler fires. But let's look at some additional testimony here. We talked already about the testimony of, oh great, hang on one second, of the first responders. Let's look at another witness. Hang on one second. Oh, great. And that witness would be the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, which detected seismic waves. So this is about 20 miles north of the North Tower and or the World Trade Center. And now there are seismic signals near the time of the plane impacts, and later we'll look at the time of near the time of the collapse of these towers or destruction. So let's look at the plane impacts first. There's a 0.9 magnitude earthquake, if you will, at the North Tower near the time of the plane impacts. At the South Tower, we're talking about a 0.7 magnitude event. And the problem here, because NIST says this is because of the airplane, right? A reasonable conclusion. But we're going to look at that in some detail. And we notice that the seismic event occurs at 8:46 and 26 seconds, but the plane doesn't impact for 14 seconds later. So how can the plane impact cause that seismic event? Makes no sense, right? Well, NIST comes along and says, well, wait a minute. We don't trust the NTSB radar, which is accurate to within a second historically. We looked at the videos and we think they made a mistake somehow. We think the videos show that the plane impacted 10 seconds earlier. Okay, well, you're still 4 seconds off. Well, what do you say now? Well, we're going to go back to Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory and get them to move their data back 3 seconds, for which they did a report, but which report is not available to the public for scrutiny. This is privately contracted. We don't get to see what their reasoning was at all. So you can see how fishy this is. Well, the same thing happens at the South Tower. Look, the seismic event occurs at 9:02 and 54 seconds. The plane doesn't impact in this case for 17 seconds. But yes, this says we don't trust the NTSB radar, which is accurate to within a second. We're going to do our own research and look at the videos, and we determined that the plane impacted 12 seconds earlier. Well, wait a minute, you're still 5 seconds off. What are you going to do? They go back to Lamont Doherty again, get them to move their data back yet again 3 seconds, and we don't get to see that report whatsoever. Presumably, the next 2 seconds that they're off is within the tolerance. Well, what could have caused those seismic events so many seconds before the planes hit? Well, here's a couple of clues. We have Mike Porcaro, who was down in the basement, said the whole building seemed to shake and there was a loud explosion. They arrived at the sea level of the basement. They found the machine shop gone. Nothing there but rubble. We're talking about a 50-ton hydraulic press, gone. The two made their way to the parking garage, found that it too was gone. There was no walls. There was rubble on the floor. You can't see anything. Wow. A steel and concrete fire door that weighed 300 pounds, wrinkled up like a piece of aluminum foil lying on the ground. A bomb had gone off in the building. Well, this is interesting because it's also supported by 14 other witnesses about bombs in the building. In this case, William Rodriguez says the plane, the bomb had gone off in the building before the plane impacted.
I was a janitor. Like I said, on that day, there was an explosion on the basement, and this is prior to the building got hit by the plane, and then the plane hit.
I think a bomb went off in the lobby first, then a plane hit the building.
The bomb hit the lobby first, and a couple of seconds in the first plane hit.
Well, and we'll show you other witnesses too, but I'm going to add those later. We have Andre Rousseau, an applied geophysics expert, author of more than 50 published papers on progressive mechanical waves and geology. He says, hey, wait a minute, slow down, everybody. The frequency of the Raleigh waves attributed by Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory to the impacts were on the order of only 1 hertz, 1 cycle per second. Aircraft crash impacts have much higher frequencies, above 10 hertz, and often around 100 hertz, 2 orders of magnitude higher. But those frequencies were filtered out by the bandpass filters used by Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory. The range of the instruments doesn't even allow for recording of such waves. So how could NIST have come to that conclusion? The seismic equipment is designed to detect seismic events like earthquakes and explosions around 1 hertz. He even goes on to say, well, that's a strange slide. The actual waves generated by the crash had to have been deadened before hitting the ground. Okay, let's go to the collapses, because Lamont Doherty also picked up signals near the time of the building collapses. Now, hold on a second. 2.1 magnitude earthquake in the case of the South Tower, 2.3 magnitude earthquake in the case of the North Tower. But let's slow this down. Oh dear. Here, we're gonna do this thing again that we do when this happens. What I have to do is reboot my machine, by the way. That'll solve a lot of these problems. I have to do that every time before I start, which is frustrating. Okay, here we go. Now, the waves come in at 10:28 and 31 seconds. Okay, the tower starts its descent, even according to NIST, at 10:28 and 31 seconds, which is 9 seconds earlier. Now, we do have the first debris hitting the ground about a second later, but the heaviest debris doesn't even strike the ground for 4 seconds. So what does NIST do about this discrepancy? They go back to LDEO again and have them move their data back 3 seconds in this, again, another private report that they will not release the results for. So that we're getting used to this by now, right? Well, what could, and by the way, both of them missed these very clearly defined P wave and S waves back before and after the start of the descent of the towers. Well, what could have caused those? 4 seconds before the start of the descent of the towers. Any bells ringing here? Oh, yeah. Those first responders who heard explosions and then saw the building coming down. We saw about several dozen of those witnesses. Well, there's another witness here, and that's the camera. Tripod-mounted video camera experiencing shakes 6 and 10 seconds before the start of the collapse, corroborating the first responder witnesses that you saw. Here's the camera. And this is documented carefully, by the way, by Graham McQueen in 2009. Did the earth shake before the South Tower hit the ground? I'll start it, and here we're still, and now you see the shake. That was the shake, and 6 seconds later, about right now, you see the descent of the tower. So a camera-mounted tripod, a tripod-mounted camera is shaking exactly 6 seconds before. That's real supporting evidence here. And here's another one, by the way. In this case, it's 10 seconds before. This camera is on this roof watching the North Tower, and it's still right here, but right now, you see the shake? I'm not shaking it. That's not me. That's publicly available footage. Then you see these explosions on the top of the tower, and then you see the tower coming down exactly 6 seconds after that shake. So this corroborates the eyewitness accounts here and and something else going on before the descent of the towers. Now let's go to the South Tower. 2.1 magnitude event. And the start of the seismic event occurs at 9:59 and 04 seconds. The tower starts its descent before that, about 5 seconds. And the heaviest debris doesn't hit the pavement until 7 seconds later. How can the heavy debris hitting the pavement be causing the seismic signal 7 seconds earlier? That makes no sense. So what does NIST do with that discrepancy? They go back to LDEO yet again and get them to move their data back 3 seconds, which gets them a little closer to their target, plus or minus 3 seconds, I guess. So, 2 seconds. So this is why we all have to do our independent thinking and analysis, because NIST is giving us nothing but fraud all day. What could account for this in the case of the South Tower? We go back again and we find another tripod-mounted camera on the ground recording explosions, is what we're learning here, right? 3 seconds before the start of the collapse. This one's more subtle. This is New York 1 TV station, tripod-mounted camera, and starting the video, and it's very subtle. Watch, that was the shake right there. 3 seconds later, the building is coming down. So, corroborating the witnesses about explosions before the tower is coming down. Now, the official narrative says that these are due to the debris hitting the ground, but there's other things we got to look at here. It didn't hit the ground. It pulverized to dust. The concrete did. We saw that already, right? The dust is spread over 3 square miles. It's not causing any seismic component. The steel is shattered to individual wall units, 4 to 8 tons each, landing 600 feet or up to outside the towers. They're not providing any seismic component, not a 4-ton structural steel unit or even an 8-ton. And they don't even hit the ground at once, but over a period of 15 seconds. And they don't even hit the ground. They hit a 7-story concrete basement structure. So it's quite diffuse, the seismic component from those. They're equally distributed over the entire superblock. Now watch this. Each of these buildings are virtually identical. Their collapses, their destruction is virtually identical. How can they produce on an order of magnitude the North Tower greater energy release than the South Tower? I say in order of magnitude, that's 1.6 times greater energy. This is the logarithmic scale in seismic activity. 2.3 is 1.6 times greater than 2.1. So how can that even happen if that wasn't the result of a natural collapse? No, it must have been something else which was dramatically more energy for some reason. I don't know the reason in the North Tower. Andre Rousseau says, identical buildings and nearly identical collapses can't possibly produce seismic events of extremely different energy releases on an order of magnitude. Now, all of this is very well documented, or at least summarized, in point TT7 of the best 9/11 evidence from the Consensus 9/11 group, led by Elizabeth Woodworth and David Ray Griffin. So I highly encourage you to check out that work at consensus911.org. Now, some people mistakenly equate the Seattle Kingdom seismic event, which was 2.3, to the World Trade Center, and said, how could they be the same? Well, first of all, they're not the same. I mean, this is a 25,000 ton concrete roof which impacts the ground virtually at once, versus the Twin Towers where we saw the complete diffuse peppering the ground of the steel elements individually over 15 seconds, and the concrete powdered over 3 square miles of lower Manhattan. There's no comparison. It's apples and oranges. So don't worry about that. But you can do more research on this at these locations. And I encourage you to do your own research always. There's additional data in FEMA, data from the FEMA and NIST reports. The NIST report, they were tasked by Congress with $20 million to determine how and why World Trade Center 1 and 2 collapsed. But they have their own objective, and it's hidden on page 13, page 82 in footnote number 13. What was it? They said, well, the focus of the investigation was on the sequence of events from the instant of aircraft impact to the initiation of collapse. What? It doesn't actually include the structural behavior of the towers after the conditions for collapse initiation were reached. Wait a minute. You spent $20 million, created 10,000 pages, tasked by Congress to explain the collapses, and you only have a half a page on the events following the initiation of collapse? The initiation is when the first truss sagged and pulled in that first column. What do they say in this half page anyway? The structure below the level of collapse initiation offered minimal resistance. The large building mass far exceeded the capacity of the intact structure below to absorb that through deformation. Came down essentially in free fall. The floors below were unable to arrest the moving mass. Wow. This is pure speculation. There is no analysis here with supporting calculations whatsoever, like Tony Zambodi and others did in their attempt to explain how this collapse never would have happened, absent explosives. It's a pre-collapse report, the NIST report. It should have been called the final report on the initiation of collapse of the World Trade Center. We wrote NIST an extensive request for correction, which you can do with agencies in the U.S. government. They're under the NIST is under the Department of Commerce, so they're subjected to the Data Quality Act. So they write back, we were unable to provide a full explanation of the total collapse of the Twin Towers. Wow. You were unable to provide an adequate explanation whatsoever and no analysis whatsoever. They wrote back and said, NIST found no corroborating evidence to suggest that explosives were used. Well, wait a minute. A year later, when pressed, they finally admit in writing, NIST did not test for the presence of explosive residue. You will not find what you will not look for. Well, this is why we have so many experts, like 100 structural engineers signed on to the petition at AE 9/11 Truth, including William Rice, who summed it up well. The prevailing theory would have us believe that each of the Twin Towers inexplicably collapsed upon itself while crushing 287 massive columns on each floor while maintaining a near free fall acceleration, as if the 80,000 or more tons of structural steel framework underneath didn't even exist. Another structural engineer, David Scott, near free fall collapse violates laws of physics. And fire protection engineer, Scott Granger, all three collapses were very uniform in nature. Natural collapses, due to unplanned events, are not uniform. That's clear. Van Romero, director of the Energetic Materials Research and Testing Center at Tech, effects of explosions on buildings. He's that expert. He says there are explosive devices caused the collapse of both towers, too methodical to be a chance result of airplanes colliding with structures. After the airplanes hit the towers, there were some explosive devices inside the buildings that caused them to collapse. Well, that's consistent with the early reporters and witnesses, but he withdrew this statement, having been presumably threatened with reduced funding from federal agencies who were their primary funders at the Explosives Materials Research and Testing Center. As did Mathis Levy, who before joining the FEMA team had this to say.
You've seen many of the managed demolitions where they implode a building and they cause it essentially to fall vertically because they cause all of the vertical columns to fail simultaneously. That's exactly what it looked like, and that's what happened.
Okay, as did Ronald Hamburger, who said, it appeared to me that charges had been placed in the building, but then somebody told him no bombs were detonated. He said, I was very surprised. He withdrew his statement after he joined the FEMA team. And Mike Taylor, who says, the collapse of the Twin Towers looked like a classic controlled demolition. And Andre Rousseau, applied geophysics expert, who has not retracted his statements. Even if the plane impacts and the fall of the debris from the towers onto the ground could have generated seismic waves, their magnitude would have been insufficient to be recorded 20 miles away and should have been very similar in the two cases to one another. But they were not. Controlled demolition is confirmed and demonstrated. What about the evidence? Surely in the most puzzling and argued about collapses in history and modern structures, it would have been preserved and kept and for investigators to do detailed forensic analysis. But here's one of the structural engineers who was hoping to accomplish such, who had a National Science Foundation grant to study this deal, Abu Hassan Astani Azal.
After 9/11, we realized that Port Authority of New York and New Jersey has sent all the steel that we need to study. That's why I'm here to study steel. Has sent all the steel to recycling plant to go to China for recycling. For what? For 15 cents a pound. Just nothing. And all the evidence of steel went to melting pot.
After 9/11, a law was passed requiring that such materials be saved for study.
Too little, too late, apparently. All the evidence of the steel went to the melting pot to China for recycling, prompting Bill Manning, editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering magazine, to cry out, crucial evidence that can answer many questions is on the slow boat to China, showing an astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately. But it didn't. In easily the largest and most perplexing structural failures in history, they have 400 truckloads per day starting just 2 weeks after 9/11. Putting that steel on these barges, sending them to China. This is the illegal destruction of evidence in a crime scene, which is why we have so many challenging the scientific method that was used by NIST, because it wasn't used. And that shows what? Which hypothesis is shown by the evidence you've seen today? Did jet planes and fire bring down the building, or did explosions with controlled demolition? We believe we've shown the 8 key characteristic features and some very uncharacteristic features of controlled demolition today. We'll get to the rest of those next week in part 3 of this series, by the way. This is direct evidence of destruction with explosives. Fire does not create these features, any of them, let alone all of them. And with additional circumstantial and corroborative testimony and evidence, we believe now that we've shown proof of controlled demolition, proof beyond a doubt. But that's what we say. What do you say? If you're watching live with us on this webinar, Andy's going to let you know how you can, what you think, and what you want to ask. We've got some questions. Andy, how do they do that?
Okay, please submit your questions in the same input form that we talked about earlier. That's at ae911truth.org. Just select live webinars. Actually, first you select continuing education and then live webinars, and then you'll see a box. You can type them right in. Also, and we're going to tell you about some of the ways that you can get involved if, now that you're informed, you agree that this evidence is compelling and warrants a new investigation.
Perfect. And while you're there, by the way, everybody subscribe to our email newsletter. You will get a couple of times a month the latest evidence that we're putting together, latest efforts we're getting toward a real investigation. And there are a lot of them. In fact, I'll show you some of those coming up. So just take a couple of minutes and put your email in there and get informed. On our website, we have extraordinary quantities of evidence, videos, documents. It's all there. And while you're there, sign the petition, especially if you're one of our 3,000 architects and engineers. We need more. We need 10,000. That's the direction we're heading. If you're not an architect or engineer, you can sign also supporting those who are. We have 20,000 others. And donate to us. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization dedicated to getting the word out, to getting a real investigation. We're doing everything that we possibly can every day with our staff of 6, and it just takes work, it takes effort, and it takes resources. So will you join us in this way? Support us with your donation to AE911 Truth Now. You can only imagine how much work we're doing, and you'll find once you sign up for our email newsletter how important that work is and the variety of it. And you can become a member for as little as a cup of coffee a day. Please join the family of sustaining supporters of AE911 Truth. If you can't do any of that, there's ways you can still help us, right, Andy?
Absolutely. There's always work to be done, and we're always looking for people to help us do that work. So if you get a few hours a week to donate, it really does go a long way. But the first step is to contact us. You do that by going to ae911truth.org. There's a volunteer form on there. You just click that, you fill it out. We'll see how best you'll fit in. That's typically how you think you're going to fit in. And there's work for every type of person. Some people prefer to keep to themselves. Other people prefer to be out front talking to members of the public. We'll find where that is. And also, too, if you've got a skill that we don't list on our website, we certainly want to hear about it, and maybe we can apply it to this important fight. So
Absolutely.
please consider
And
volunteering.
there's things you can do on your own, too, by the way. You can contact your elected representatives. Andy's going to tell you how to do that. And we'll even go to the meeting with you on the phone. And television, radio, newspaper, architects and engineers, tell everyone you know, screen the DVDs, give out our brochures. You know, you can get 100 of them for $10. They're on our website and our store, ae911truth.org. You can download the famous now 130-page finite element analysis of Building 7 created by Professor Leroy Halsey at the University of Alaska, in which he completely debunks the crazy theory that Building 7 came down by fire. Very, very detailed report that thousands of you supported with thousands of donations. So amazing work that was done there. And that what we're doing is we're taking that work to Congress, along with the other work that we've done, the petition and so forth. And what are we going to do there, Andy?
All right, so this is the Bobby McIlvaine World Trade Center Investigation Act. It's a path for justice for the nearly 3,000 who died on that day, and it's named after Bobby McIlvaine, who died in the North Tower lobby from an explosion. So what this would do is it would set up a select committee. It can be passed in either house of Congress to look into exactly what Richard has been talking about for years, the destruction of these buildings, have a real investigation into the evidence of controlled demolition on that day. And it's been written in such a way so they can't just drag out a couple of NIST flunkies to regurgitate some talking points and get a rubber stamp from Congress. They actually have to look into this evidence. But again, politicians don't do anything unless they are getting a lot of pressure from their constituents. That's where you come in, and that's what Richard was talking about. You got to get active. And the good thing about the current times, the one good thing is that they will take meetings over the phone or a conference call or whatnot. So the way you get involved is first by learning about the Bobby McIlvaine Act. You go to ae911truth.org/justice. You can learn all about it there. You can print out a copy of it. And then you make a meeting with your member of Congress. You look them up. You go to their contact page. They usually have a section on there for setting up a meeting. And if you need any advice, you can just write to us at congress@ae911truth.org. We'll give you advice on how to do it. We can even tell you what to write to get the meeting. And then the meeting would include Richard and Roland and probably myself too, and yourself. And we talked to the member of Congress, asked them to pass the Bobby McIlvaine Act. We also have work going on with a request for correction in NIST. So a lot of stuff to talk about with them, but you got to take that first step because you're the constituent. So please consider doing that.
And guess what? There are a number of efforts, as I mentioned, we're doing in the legal front, including the grand jury investigation, in which the U.S. attorney has agreed to comply with the law requiring him to give our 60 exhibit petition to a special grand jury. And you've seen a lot of that evidence today. You'll see more in next week's webinar, part 3 of this series. We've also sued the FBI because they did not provide our evidence, as they were required to do by law, to Congress in the 2015 9/11 Commission review. And that is going to be real exciting because that takes this evidence public. We've also have an effort to get a new inquest into the murder of Jeff Campbell, who died in the North Tower on 9/11. And his family has now successfully, with your support, filed a petition for a new inquest into his death. That has a great opportunity for success as we look forward with anticipation to this month, the submittal of that petition to the UK Attorney General. Very exciting. And now all of this evidence that's going to these legal bodies has been summarized by 40 high-rise architects, structural engineers, metallurgists, chemists, physicists, controlled demolition experts, all laying out this evidence for you. I just want to give you a couple minutes taste before we get to your questions here in just a moment. Take a look at this.
I don't want to be involved in conspiracy theories. There are lots of them. They can go on. We can speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings came down.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy.
This is what NIST has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to the descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Dus dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten.
What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
NIST excluded the documents from FEMA in Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust samples. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
All the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved.
In the dust, what we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
And in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that these red-grade crystals are very high-temperature incendiaries.
And we have watched as scientific integrity has been undermined and scientific research politicized in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agendas.
If this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime. Evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. When the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
Well, yes, you can watch this video online free on YouTube, the 1 hour version, or you can look at the 1.5 hour version, which is extraordinary because it includes half a dozen incredible psychologists that give us insight into why the 9/11 issue is so difficult for people to grasp and to share with others. Also, the 90-minute version has a second DVD in there, extended interviews with all of these experts. So I encourage you to pick that up at our store on our website, ae911truth.org. Now you can download the 50-page booklet at PDF for free, beyondmisinformation.org. What science says about the destruction of these towers It rips apart the theory of NIST that these buildings came down by fire, and provides the real evidence. So you can also get the really nice coffee table version, give to VIPs and so forth, $10 on our store. Watch the classic version of this lecture, all summarized in 2 hours. It's free on YouTube, or you can get it to DVD in our store. And the 15-minute video from Ed Asner on World Trade Center 7, narrated by Ed Asner, is now on our, well, it's free on YouTube and is also on our store. Now, we have just, like yesterday, released the 1-hour new version of the film 7, which is the story about Leroy Halsey and the finite element analysis of these buildings. It shows how ludicrous the NIST story was. This is narrated by director Dylan Avery, creator of Loose Change 9/11. So we encourage you to look for that. The DVD, I think you can order it now in our store, or if not, very soon. But it's available on all kinds of platforms, including Vudu, Hulu, those types. It'll be on hopefully Netflix soon too. But there's ways to watch it right now. You can find that out on our website at ae911truth.org. That should be a prominent slide right up in the front of the website. And at this point, Andy, do we have questions? I hope so.
Yeah, we have a question and a comment from YouTube. Let's start with the question. It says, matter that is dense can accelerate easily through air resistance and accelerate less easily through the resistance of water. But what does science say about the top 15 stories accelerating at a rate of 64% the acceleration of gravity through the bottom 95 stories of structural steel? If science says that can't happen, then wouldn't all the best educational institutes of America be telling this by now that we were lied to? Other than Alaska, I haven't heard a word from any of the famous, and I think it got cut off here, but I'll just look and see here. By the famous universities, I must assume that either of these institutes all agree with the official story, or that they simply don't care.
Well, I certainly
Any
agree
comments?
with the viewer that they seem not to care in large measure. They don't want to take on something that could stain them with the label of conspiracy theory. They all want to assume that NIST and FEMA have already tied this up in a nice knot with a nice bow. And this is particularly true as we've struggled for 14 years with the American Society of Civil Engineers and the American Institute of Architects, of which I'm one of 90,000 members. We've been going to their conferences for years and creating quite a scene and with multiple detailed efforts to get their attention and the attention of their members. They do not want to touch it in large measure. Those who actually see the evidence at our evidence booth at these conferences are quite moved, as I'm sure you have been if you have stayed with us through this presentation, and especially the next one next week, part 3 of this 3-part series on the extreme heat of the World Trade Center towers. When people see it, then they're moved. The difficult part can be bringing people to the table to actually look at it. And we've got DVDs, as I've mentioned, that can make it a lot easier. But yes, science says that you can't have a 15-story section, like in the case of the North Tower, driving through much stronger, cold, hard, intact steel below the point of jet plane impacts, and not slowing down at least. And of course, as we've pointed out today, it would have come to a rest. The science says that there's an equal and opposite destructive force that would destroy the top lighter part before much of the heavier, stronger part below was destroyed. The science says that it can't come down accelerating, getting faster and faster and faster every second. It would slow down as columns were buckling and trying to resist that falling mass. But that did not happen. It's 64% of acceleration, as the viewers pointed out. So yes, the institutions should be taking this on, and some of them are. We have a review underway in England, International Mechanical Institute of Engineers, something like that, mechanical engineers, and we'll be having a result from their review, which is going very, very well. But we've got so many reviews already. Again, the Alaska study completely shows that Building 7 could not have come down by fire. And we're trying to get that into the hands now of every institution that provides a structural or civil engineering degree. And we've given dozens of presentations to chapters of the American Society of Civil Engineers. Student chapters are very interested in this, and to groups of structural engineers out there as well. It's very exciting, but very, very slow progress. Andy, you might have something to add to that.
I think you pretty much encapsulated it. You know, I said this before, at least on my shows. If you watch a Hollywood movie where there's some kind of conspiracy or something like that, they make it sound like all you got to do is get the evidence to the press, to the scientific community, to the president, and it's over in 5 minutes. And that is just not reality. And in real life, what science says doesn't matter so much as what your boss says or what the donors say. And so you could have the most slam dunk case, but if it's not politically useful for them, or if it doesn't work out politically, that pursuing it is going to help this person or this institution, then a lot of times they will choose to overlook it. So that is a barrier that we face.
Okay, is there any other questions?
There's a comment from YouTube. We can just maybe address it for a moment here. It says, you have to realize that you can't force people to accept this. You should point them towards things like this and let them watch for themselves. And I just want to say I completely agree with that point. And a lot of times you can't be aggressive with this information. You just got to show them people the information, and sometimes they won't come around to it until later, until they see it coming.
Yeah,
from other
I found
sources.
that about
So
the
that's my
third
2
time
cents
somebody
on it.
gets pinged with this information or this issue, they start to perk up. That's true for myself with other issues that I've become aware of, having started down this rabbit hole of 9/11. It takes a few pings. So just, give people a DVD here and there, give them a brochure, talk to them, give them our website. Blame it on us. We're 3,000 architects and engineers. We've got our necks on the line, right? Use our technical credibility, which, by the way, is 30,000 years of combined technical and building credibility. That's a lot. So use it. Use us. You don't have to let them call you a conspiracy theorist. Just say, hey, have you checked out all these architects and engineers? Look what they're saying. We put it out there in so many ways. We've got so many DVDs now. This is like 10 of them. And so what more can we do, to provide you the information? You have to pick it up and get it out there now. It's your turn. The ball is in your court. Let the buck stop with you. And so that brings us to the end of part 2, the Twin Towers explosive destruction today. Again, next week we start with the Twin Towers extreme heat on Thursday, Pacific time, 1 p.m. High-rise fires, pyroclastic-like clouds, molten steel and iron microsphere, thermite, nanothermite. We go into all of it in greater detail. And then, by the way, we start all over again in January. of 2020. Yeah, let's get through December. If we can all get through December intact, we'll be well. And then we'll start over in January and see what we got left over of our country, and start again. So looking forward to sharing this information with you about the World Trade Center Building 7. If you don't want to wait till then, look for it on YouTube. All these are going up on YouTube. So thanks so much, everybody. Thanks, Andy. It's been great fun, and we'll keep doing it until we have a real investigation. Take care.